What's up, everyone? They let us get to Friday again, so that means it's time for another episode of TheLeaf podcast. Now, in this episode, I have a viewer story. This story is from Mutant Buzzard, and Mutant Buzzard has sent in a few stories before, and this one is no exception to those other ones of how strange and wild and everything in between they are. So, for this episode of the podcast, we're going to do this story because it's wild. And if this is your first time listening to the podcast, it's a little more conversational than the other videos, but there's still a lot of spooky stuff going on. So Mutant Buzzard, I hope I can do this story justice, and let's get into it. Back in my outlaw days, I hung out with there ain't no PC way of telling it as it was. I hung out with an old Mexican drug dealer by the name of, that's right, you guessed it, Pablo. Pablo had, at the time I knew him anyway, the thin veneer of a gentleman farmer. He had property with water rights, where he grew grass hay and ran a few head of cattle. Pablo's farm borders some Forest Service land where he had grazing rights for his cattle. That public land included a lot of very rough and remote mountainous country, but he was not always the fine, upstanding citizen that he became, or rather, as he presented himself. Pablo cut his teeth camping out in the woods, growing dope, and watering plants, then harvesting at the end of summer. And Pablo didn't tell this as it was written. He told different parts at different times, and I pieced it together for continuity's sake and wrote it all down. Starting when he was 10, Pablo promised his mother that he would listen to his brother and never use white powder drugs, just beer and weed. A promise that Pablo kept. After he camped out with his older brother every summer, working for another Mexican drug dealer known as El Patron, who had a similar setup to what future Pablo had, namely, private access to Forest Service land in Northern California. Pablo's brother taught him the ins and outs of outdoor horticulture, and he would cut Pablo in whenever El Patron rewarded Pablo's brother, Franco, with a thick bundle of cash. Pablo got a cool grand, a lot of money for most people, and for 10-year-old Pablo, it was a small fortune. By the time he was 13, Pablo was running his own patch in the humble California boonies. With his brother's help, Pablo's camp was well stocked with canned food, a stack of Playboy, High Times, Nat Geo, and Penthouse magazines, a book on marijuana horticulture, a Webster dictionary, a Spanish to English dictionary, and a Bible. Pablo and his brother would alternate going to the Authets plot every other week for Sunday Bible study. Their plots were about 90 minutes walk apart. Other things include a single-shot 12-gauge shotgun and a .22 Magnum revolver, as well as other useful things like coyote urine that helped keep deer and bunnies away from his crops. Pablo's plot also had running water from a camouflaged plastic pipe that pulled creek water some 800 yards over a small hump in the ground via a siphon. There was stuff to fix the pipe and 5-gallon buckets for carrying water just in case. Pablo also had a few tools, a handsaw, an axe, a shovel, and all the like for growing stuff and whatnot. Some of the tools, like the axe, he used as weapons in a pinch. Pablo's plot was about a 4-hour hike following the creek to El Patron's property line fence, where there was a dead drop by a certain cedar fence post. Another of El Patron's hired guns, checked every day in case Pablo needed anything from town. Pablo also had a guitar that he practiced with while camping in his spare time. He was never idle at camp, and he learned plenty. He could start a fire with just his pocket knife to make a spindle and a flat stick like Ishi. Pablo learned to make snares and often had venison to eat while at camp. With his brother's help, Pablo built a well-camouflaged camp with a dugout lean-to that kept him dry. This lean-to was on the small rise between the creek and the plants, so when it rained water, it mostly ran into the creek. There were fish in the creek, and fish guts made good fertilizer. Pablo's brother taught him that. Unfortunately, the guts could also attract predators and scavengers, so Pablo also set out some snares and traps to catch raccoons and the like to keep them from damaging his crop. He also made tripwire alarms with fishing hooks, lines, and emptied chili cans with rocks for alarms. And it was a good thing, too. 2 times the alarms went off. The first time it was coyotes that were attracted by the smell of the camp, and Pablo shot one dead with his .22. The others fled. Pablo tried to tan the coyote's hide with its brains and did a fair job of it too. At least it didn't smell rotten. Pablo tacked the hide onto a large tree as a warning to the other coyotes. He claimed it worked too, as he had no more coyote trouble other than some occasional howling and yipping at the sky in the distance. The next time that the fishing hook, line, and soup can alarm went off, it was a she-bear with a cub that Pablo chased off with an air horn, one of several noisemakers that his brother had supplied him with. He was glad that the air horn worked and that he didn't have to use his shotgun. Pablo had several different shotgun rounds, including slugs, double-aught buck, birdshot, and some custom rock salt shells. Still, he was glad that he didn't have to shoot the bears. Another noisemaker Pablo made was a tom-tom. It was made out of a burned-out, hollowed-out log with a buckskin rawhide drumhead. Pablo also made a roaring drum, patterned after the one they used on old wildlife television shows. It was Mutual of Oklahoma's Wild Kingdom, where Martin Perkins and Jim Fowler used one to call in male lions. Basically, it was a tom-tom with a rope in the center of the drum, that when you pulled the rope, letting it slide through your hand, it made a loud roaring sound. That one was used to scare away people from the pot patch. Life was good for Pablo. He had more dinero than a 13-year-old should have. He had a dirt bike, a 3-wheeler, nice clothes for him and his mother, and a bank account that he was saving money for a car when he turned 16. Then at the end of the summer, as Pablo was harvesting his crop and closing up shop for the winter, things began to get weird. Pablo was dismantling his traps and snares when he found several of the snares, those that were further away from his plot, were broken, and some being AWOL. There was also a strange scent in the air, a musky, not unpleasant or totally pleasant smell. The scent was somewhere in between pleasant and unpleasant. Pablo described it as smelling like rain on hot pavement with the hints of ammonia and sulfur. On edge, Pablo looked for clues, and he found some for sure. He found what could have been large footprints, but they were indistinct on the forest litter of dead tree parts, leaves, pine needles, and the like. The sulfur smell made him think about how you can use sulfur to kill bugs, so he hoped maybe it was his brother pranking him. But soon after that, he found some middle-length black fur, about 6 feet high, caught in the bark of some underbrush. He nervously picked up the pace and hurried back to camp, where he rolled a joint to calm his nerves. As he was hitting the joint, he coughed out a mighty cloud of smoke, and then he heard someone sneeze, a dainty sneeze. Looking for the source of the sneeze, he cast his view in that direction and laid eyes on a large, wide-shouldered, hairy person. He hit the joint again, having some small trouble bringing it back to his lip on account of his hands trembling and the upright humanoid being dangerously close. He took another mighty hit from the joint as he studied the creature before him. Pablo saw a black, hairy person with an almost human-like, hairless face, bright brown eyes under a thick brow and a cone-shaped head, a flat nose, and yellow tusks in a large, thick-lipped mouth. Pablo saw breasts on the chest of the hairy person, covered in fur, except for her nipples. As badly as he wanted to run, Pablo didn't trust his legs. Then, it was too late to run, as he was within arm's reach of the hairy person. So Pablo took another hit from the joint and passed it to the hairy person, and she figured out how to smoke it. Her first hit made her cough, and that made Stone Pablo laugh in the face of the absurdity of it all. If the monster killed him, at least he would die high, and it would be an epic death, as he always had both of his sheath knives and his .22 Magnum on him. Another thing he was grateful for was that his brother taught him to always be armed. Always keep your weapons loaded and close at hand, even when sleeping or even taking a dump. Thankfully, Pablo didn't have to fight the hairy person, who had now eaten the roach. Calmed by the weed and the fact that the monster wasn't attacking him, Pablo tried to communicate with her by introducing himself as Pablo, pointing to his chest and his face and saying his name. The monster seemed to understand, and she pointed to herself and grumbled something unintelligible, but she seemed to understand that he was Pablo. Pablo and the hairy person explored his camp as he was getting ready to leave when something caught her eye. Pablo told her what it was, and she was particularly interested in a sliver of soap, Irish Spring if I recall correctly. She held up the soap to her face for closer inspection, giving it the smell test. Then she ate the soap. Pablo said she had mostly square teeth, but still had fangs and tusk-like teeth on her lower jaw. She had a cone-shaped head. Pablo couldn't help but laugh at the poor Sasquatch's funny faces she made as the soap began to foam, 'cause everything's funny when you're smoking the Mary Jane. Then, to her delight, she learned how to blow bubbles, and she didn't seem to be put off by the taste. Bubbles, as Pablo came to call her, laid down, face up, and blew bubbles and seemed to be laughing, or maybe dying. Maybe soap was toxic to hairy people. More than a little worried, Pablo prayed that Bubbles would be all right, and then he got back to work. Soon, everything important, mainly the dope, was ready to go, but everything that could reasonably be left behind for next year's camp was hidden in well-camouflaged cases. Once everything was loaded and ready to go, Pablo rolled 2 joints out of his bag of pot leaves. All summer, Pablo had been caring for his plants, removing and smoking the sun leaves, the big leaves at the lower part of the plant that starts to turn yellow as the plants begin to flower, using the nutrients in the leaves, turning them yellow. As the days grew shorter, the plants would start to flower. The male plants started flowering first and needed to be done away with, so Pablo plucked, dried, and fried, or rather smoked them. Pablo rolled 2 joints, lighting the first one, handing it to Bubbles, as she seemed to be over the soap poisoning, thank the Lord. Then, he lit the other one and hit it hard and fast. He ate the roach and picked up the poles of his travois and started dragging it, meaning to be at El Patron's fence before dark. And when he got to the creek, he emptied his piss pot, something that he had to do all summer so the place wouldn't be found because of the smell. All summer, he had basically been shitting into a plastic bag and using his travois to haul it down to the dead drop at El Patron's fence. Pablo had to make that trip 4 times that summer, but that was better than having a stinking slit trench latrine anyways, and he could fish on the way back to the camp as a bonus. Bubbles was following Pablo closely and grunted. She was asking what the travois was, so he told her, and then she carried it all the way to El Patron's fence for Pablo. They arrived at least an hour before dark. Pablo sometimes had a hard time keeping up after setting the travois where he could keep an eye on it and fish the creek. Pablo and Bubbles smoked joint after joint till full-on dark. As they were fishing, Pablo caught some and gave them to her, who ate them whole. Then they heard something hooping in the distance, which was followed by the crack of breaking wood. Bubbles got up to leave, just as Pablo saw the headlights of El Patron's truck. As Bubbles was leaving, Pablo gave her the sack of pot leaves, and then Bubbles disappeared silently into the night, making Pablo pinch himself to make sure he wasn't dreaming. He remembered fondly that Bubbles' breath smelled like Irish Spring soap, fish, and dope smoke. As the pickup rolled up, the driver, the armed guard, and Pablo's brother, Franco, jumped out to help Pablo load the respectable harvest. El Patron will be pleased. Good job, Nino. The driver, El Segundo, El Patron's ranch foreman, assured him. Then asked Pablo, who was that? I call her Bubbles. Her, Franco teased. Did you get any? Pablo flushed, grateful it was dark, as the others laughed. The driver said, load up, pendejos. Let's get back before Bubbles' pissed-off papa makes his presence known. El Segundo handed Pablo a 5-pound bag of huge Macintosh apples and told them to put it on just the other side of El Patron's fence. Still blushing, Pablo did as he was told, and the driver said, Vamos, pendejos. Pablo, you take shotgun. And nobody argued. Not having to ride back in the dark with stinking bags of caca was the greatest feeling Pablo had ever had up until that point. El Patron was pleased, commending Pablo on a job well done, and no one called him a liar when he told them about Bubbles. But they did laugh, and Pablo blushed, but no one doubted his story, even one bit, and the fat stacks of fedia made it all okay. We have an agreement with the gente salvaje. El Patron explained how his father had been able to communicate with them via a Modoc shaman. That is why we don't shit in their woods, to keep the peace. Then, El Patron showed Pablo some guns, 38s, 357s, 44s, and 45s, and told him to pick one to keep the peace. Pablo settled on a 357 Smith & Wesson double-action revolver. That winter, Pablo turned 14, and his brother would be 18 in the spring. Franco joined the Navy so as not to be drafted into the Army, with lots of tears and prayers. Pablo's mother acquiesced as her family had a long military history. Pablo's father had been working with the U.S. Navy on D-Day, firing a 5-inch 38 caliber deck gun for hours that day. With mutual promises to stay faithful to God no matter what happened, Franco kissed Pablo's mother goodbye. Pablo promised his mother that he would especially be careful next growing season, but spring couldn't be sprung soon enough for him. He was still getting good grades in class, despite smoking weed regularly, as it kept him high enough to be patient for another exciting summer camp, as he would put it to his school chums. Other than that, Pablo knew to keep his mouth shut about what was going on in his private life and El Patron's business. Pablo was good enough now with the guitar that he claimed that his summer camp was a Mexican musical camp. Pablo also blew some of his bread on a snazzy, sparkly mariachi suit and a Polaroid camera. That spring, on weekends, Pablo and El Segundo's oldest heteo, Chico, aged 11, got the forest plots ready for a planting and growing season. Next year, you can camp out all summer with Pablo, El Segundo told Chico. He is a good worker, and you need to learn from a good worker to run your own plot. Pablo's camp had been searched and disturbed, but nothing was missing, and there were plenty of giant footprints that told Pablo who the culprit or culprits were, as there were at least 3 distinct sets of tracks. Over the winter, Pablo had done some research and was pretty sure that Bubbles and the other tracks belonged to a Sasquatch, aka Bigfoot. This year, if he saw her again, he was going to try to get a picture. Summer break finally arrived, and Pablo went into the woods. He had ambitious plans, as he was tending to 2 plots this summer, both his old one and Franco's old plot. He was planning on spending alternate weeks between camps. It should be doable, as both camps had working irrigation, so Pablo wouldn't have to haul water anyway. Less than 2 weeks in, Bubbles showed back up, bold as brass, at Pablo's plot, as he was working on making the pool in the creek where the camouflage irrigation pipe pulled water from for his plants deeper. He had brought some soap too for a much-needed bath, and he was naked and didn't want to get his clothes wet. Pablo smelled Bubbles before she suddenly appeared, silently out of nowhere, so at least she didn't startle him, but he was still wary, as any naked person would be in the presence of a nearly 7-foot, 500-pound wild animal. "Hi, Bubbles," Pablo greeted his forest friend. "Did you miss me? I've got soap," as he showed the Bigfoot the bar of the Irish Spring soap. Intrigued, Bubbles joined Pablo in the pool, and Pablo had her sit down in the water that was just up over Pablo's waist, so that now their eyes were more or less at the same level. Pablo worked up a good lather and started to wash his hairy friend. Then, like something out of a penthouse forum, Pablo was washing Bubbles' breasts as she was eating the soap bubbles, and Pablo, being a 14-year-old, got an erection. Bubbles spotted the arousal and obviously knew what it meant as she presented herself for mating. Pablo said that it was like screwing a bag of Crisco, but he was a horny teenager and it didn't take him long to finish. Once he was satisfied with the depth of the pool, Pablo and Bubbles headed back to camp, and Pablo twisted up some joints for him and Bubbles. They lazed around camp enjoying each other's company until the evening, when there was a loud crack of a large tree being snapped like a toothpick, followed by a loud whooping. Bubbles patted Pablo goodbye and disappeared into the rapidly darkening boonies. The next week, Bubbles showed back up, and this time she brought her family. Pablo said it was very much analogous to meeting your girl's parents for the first time, Mama and Papa Bigfoot. Pablo said that he mentally marked on a tree Mr. and Mrs. Bigfoot's heights, and it was just shy of 8 feet for the mama, and it was a bit over 9, as near as he could figure, using his own height of 5'9" as a reference. Mama was more of a reddish-brown color and weighed around 600 pounds with a bit of a potbelly. Papa was dark brown, close to 900 pounds, and was going bald and gray around his facial hair, and he had plenty of scars too. Pablo remembered fondly describing the Bigfoot family as dome-headed, with arms slightly longer proportionally than a regular human, hairy, the fur being anywhere from an inch long on the face to around 8 to 10 inches long in other places on the body, the male hair being coarser than the female's, with Bubbles' hair being almost silky after being cleaned. Pablo also commented that the Bigfoots did seem to shed their winter coat in the spring, but he wasn't sure because he had so little reference, and it might have been the soap too. When Bubbles first introduced Pablo to her papa, he didn't look very happy about his dainty daughter taking up with a rapscallion like Pablo, but Bubbles conveyed to him that she wanted soap, so he busted out the soap and the dope. Pablo got high on weed, and the Sasquatch got sassy on soap, and soon all three were laying there on their backs, blowing bubbles at the sky, and Pablo remembered his camera, which he had purchased for just such an emergency. When their soap bubble trip was over, the Bigfoot seemed no worse for wear. Papa even patted Pablo goodbye, and Pablo knew that he was in their good graces. Pablo never saw Mama or Papa Bigfoot again, but Bubbles hung out with him off and on all summer, even helping him work both plots. And if you're wondering about the Bigfoot lovin', that only happened one time. As fall came on, things changed. There was a new Bigfoot around, a huge young male who was clearly after Bubbles. Great, Pablo thought. I'm going to get killed by a jealous Sasquatch, and he was glad he had his new, more powerful pistol. Not that he was sure it would even do much if push came to shove with this interloper, but he wasn't about to go down without at least trying to put up a fight. Bubbles introduced Pablo to this new suitor, and Pablo gave the newcomer a bar of soap, and while that helped, Pablo knew that it was only a stopgap. But by the end of the summer, all of the big feet seemed to be gone. It was a bittersweet victory for Pablo. On one hand, he survived a very, how to put this delicately, a sticky, tricky, dicky situation with a Bigfoot family and came out a winner, or at least a survivor. But on the other hand, he genuinely liked having Bubbles around. As a novia, Bubbles was a good one. As Pablo mused one night deep in his cups, she didn't talk back. Sadly, Pablo only saw Bubbles once more. The next summer, Pablo had to babysit El Segundo's Heto Chico. You know, teach him the ropes, the ins and outs of outdoor marijuana horticulture. To his credit, Chico was a good worker, even if he wasn't too bright. By the end of Pablo's junior year of high school, Chico was running his own plot back in the boonies, successfully, Pablo added proudly. But it was the second year of Pablo's summer growing and babysitting gig that he saw Bubbles for the last time. She showed him a juvenile Bigfoot that Pablo understood to be her offspring, but she didn't let him get close. Then, as soon as she was sure that Pablo had seen the young Bigfoot, they disappeared into the northern California wilderness. Pablo felt a pang of sadness and once wondered to me if he might have whelped a bastard on Bubbles. Oh, the follies of youth. All in all, life was good for Pablo. He graduated high school with middle grades, he had a girlfriend, and they consummated their love on prom night. She got accepted in Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. Pablo had been saving his dinero till he had had enough to buy a decent car, a '59 Chevy Bel Air wagon. Pablo was 18 when he went to the Big Easy and got a job washing dishes and slinging weed on the side. Things were good for Pablo. He had a nice car, a cute chick, and a small place with her. As I said, things were good. Too good. So Pablo got drafted for Nam in the same week that he turned 19. By the end of basic training, Pablo knew that the military was not for him. The army, in its infinite wisdom, sent him to medic training, but he never made it. He got lost on the way, but the army didn't see it that way and charged him with being AWOL, which according to the army did not stand for alcoholic walking on lost. According to the MPs that came to collect poor Pablo at the Mexican border, where he was apprehended trying to sneak across the border disguised as a Mormon missionary. He almost made it too, before the customs officer asked where was his companion. Busted. Pablo lamented the fix he was in. I heard him once telling this part of the story. Pablo shared a little bit of wisdom. If I'd have known what I know now, I would have gone medic training and then washed out near the end of training. I might have gotten out of going to NAM. Hindsight is always 20/20, but looking back it's still a bit fuzzy. Megadeth. One dark and stormy night, deep in our cups, we old salts told sea stories. The main difference between a fairy tale and a sea story is one starts out once upon a time, and the other starts out, this is no bull. This is no bull, said Pablo, the gentleman farmer. I was 19, living the good life in New Orleans, had my own place, a restaurant job, some lady friends, and I was in an R&B band. Life was good until I got drafted to go to NAM by way of boot camp at Fort Dix, New Jersey. Boot camp teaches you lots of things. In Pablo's case, it taught him that he didn't want to be in the army. He barely passed basic. Drill Sergeant Assbreath was not going to let him wash out until he was humping clicks in NAM. But first, the army wanted Pablo to go learn to be a medic. The reason they accepted even gold bricks like Pablo as a medic was because Charlie snipers got paid bounties for medics. Not much, but enough that Charlie would take a shot at medics, as killing the doc was a propaganda coup that demoralized the rest of the unit. So I went AWOL. Pablo gave me a small chuckle and some private painful memory. I tried to cross the Texas-Mexico border disguised as a Mormon missionary. They caught me right away. The border agent said I gave myself away because the real missionaries traveled in pairs. They turned me over to the MPs and brought me back in shackles. They let me out just long enough to don an olive green fatigue that was stenciled prisoner in black spray paint, shackled me to an MP who informed me that I was a dumbass, and then proceeded to explain and lecture at great length on all of the reasons that I was in fact a dumbass. It really sticks in my craw. Still not sure what a craw is, but you don't want to have a stick in your craw. It makes one cranky. MP Snuggles was laughing at Pablo's amateurish plan to pull one over on good old Uncle Sam. Namely, MP Snuggles told Pablo that he should have gone to medic training as it was 4 months long back in the States. Dumbass. It was the last dumbass that stung the worst because the MP was right. So what happens now? Pablo finally asked. You're on your way to Nam. Your MOS is M88 transportation, and you'll be driving trucks from the docks to the front line. Then the army locked Pablo in a cage in the back of a C-130 that refueled in San Francisco. Pablo fell asleep and woke up in Hawaii, where he was allowed to clean up and eat, and then get back into the cage on the plane. Next stop, Vietnam, where the army had moved him into a shipping container that had been repurposed into a very Spartan, think, no amenities, stockade. The only light that came through was a small slit, running water, and a bucket for a latrine. The smell and the heat were ever present. Less than a week later, the army finally let Pablo out of the shipping container jail cell. A black Spec 4 radio man with a kicked-back look and a screw-you attitude, introduced himself as Sparky. Sparky took Pablo to the supply sergeant, who issued Pablo a new kit, then to the armory, where the armorer issued Pablo an M16 rifle, a 1911 pistol with ammo and extra magazines, 3 grenades, some flares, and this advice. These are 20-round mags, but only load 18 into each one, so you don't want to fatigue the magazine springs. They don't last long if you keep them full, especially in this heat and humidity. Load 3 tracers first, so that when you fire off your whole mag, you will know that your rifle has run dry and it's time to change mags. That was good advice. Pablo knew to pay attention when an old-timer was giving you advice on weapons. Then, Sparky showed Pablo to his cot and footlocker where he could stash his gear, then to the mess tent for some chow, and then Sparky introduced Pablo to the CO, and then to the first sergeant. Take him to the first barge that needs to be unloaded, the first sergeant told Sparky. Line him out on what needs to be done. Sparky told Pablo to grab his weapons and load up for the short ride to the dock. You will need to keep an eye out for Charlie, Sparky told Pablo. They look just like everyone else, so if you're in doubt, shoot it out. Pablo was dubious. He didn't think he could shoot anyone, unless maybe they were trying to kill him, which was, according to Sparky, highly likely. If you see any VC, go ahead and start blasting, and we'll come running. How will I know if they're VC? Pablo asked dubiously. If they try to kill you, they're most likely a VC, said Sparky. Tied to the dock was a 200-foot-long barge stuffed to the gills with napalm bombs that had shifted in some rough seas and was in fact a foobar snafu, and was, in all probability, a kamikaze mission for our hero, poor Pablo. Opposite the barge, there was a garage with a forklift that they had to jumpstart. Once he was sure that the forklift would run, Sparky had Pablo unload the fuel and service the forklift, grease the zerks as it were. Once the forklift was serviced, Sparky told Pablo to unload the napalm and to watch out for VC. Pablo didn't look out, so he didn't see the VC that sabotaged the barge until it was already on fire, but that didn't stop him from using most of his tracer ammo to prevent the napalm from falling into enemy hands. Sadly, the napalm caught fire and the barge was a complete loss. Well, they threw poor Pablo back into the shipping container stockade while the incident was under investigation, but instead of a court-martial, they put him in for a medal. Pablo finally made it to his unit. He and Sparky had a good laugh about trying to kill him with the napalm. Pablo fit right in with the other screw-ups co-signed to transportation and was one of the smartest imbeciles. Pablo could at least read a map, and being a navigator had its perks, like not having to drive. Charlie's snipers were rumored to try and take out the lead driver first if possible, to muck up the works and stop the whole convoy, and it kept you inside the vehicle, though small comfort that it was. One of the unofficial landmarks on a particular well-traveled dirt road of dusty red clay that turned into greasy mud with the smallest rain was the body of a dead VC that had been dried and flattened like a roadkill toe jerky, that Special Forces interrogators showed to VC prisoners and told them that the flattened road jerky man had been tossed out of a hovering Huey and that they would be next if they didn't spill the beans. One night, after a particularly harrowing resupply run was done, Pablo and the crew, as they referred to themselves as, were relaxing with piss-warm beer and good tie-stick dope. They were bragging about their various sexual exploits. Recently, poor Pablo had gotten the dreaded "Dear Pablo" letter from his now ex-chica, who had dumped him for a second-string football player. So he was pretty low, but he was pretty high. That tie stick is some good ick, if you know what I mean, according to Pablo. Anyway, Pablo let slip that he lost his cherry to a sassy Sasquatch lass named Bubbles. Now this admission earned Pablo a strange sort of, shall we say, for lack of a better analogy, street cred, as nobody could top that, even with their lies of horny teachers, playboy bunnies, movie stars, drug-fueled orgies, and cheerleaders. That would have been the end of it, outside of some good-natured ribbing that there was this haunted place in Nam, known as Monkey Mountain, where weird stories came from with alarming frequency. Monkey Mountain just happened to be in the way of a shortcut if you could find it. Not many did, and those that didn't recommend trying, as Monkey Mountain had a sinister reputation. A reputation for being the home to a vicious tribe of giant rock-throwing apes. Giant rocks or giant apes, Pablo didn't know, nor did he really want to find out, but as it turned out, it wasn't up to him. According to the CO, it was up to the army, and the army didn't take no for an answer. When the army tells you to go to Monkey Mountain, Pablo goes to Monkey Mountain. He did so on the way to deliver some much-needed medical supplies, aka Coca-Cola, beer, and other necessities like ammo and dirty mags that keep the army fighting. Pablo had been singled out for this particular mission due to his alleged extensive experience with giant rock-throwing apes. Pablo used the heads-up to make a roaring drum out of a 55-gallon drum, and a chain from a broken block and tackle the mechanics used to pull engines out of various transportation vehicles that were used to transport important stuff, like napalm and beer. Pablo was proud of his creation, and it made an impressive roar, a loud metallic staccato that impressed everyone in the crew at the transportation pool. The recon mission of the Monkey Mountain shortcut started smoothly, as could be expected, but as the military genius Murphy said, no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy, but Pablo was prepared with soap and dope. They had delivered all the supplies and were on their way back home to base when Lieutenant Fuzzy ordered them to take the Monkey Mountain shortcut. The M39 6x6 5-ton trucks slowly ground their way up the twisting mountain road until just over the peak, where the road had really and truly headed downhill as a huge kapok tree blocking the road. It was starting to get dark as the convoy ground to a halt. The crew, led by Lieutenant Fuzzy, dismounted the 6x6 trucks to take a gander at the obstacle when the rock apes attacked with head-sized boulders, one of which hit Lieutenant Fuzzy and broke his knee. Panicked, the crew let loose on the jungle in a mad minute, blazing away at the hulking, shadowy figures in the jungle. The automatic rifle fire seemed to drive the attackers off, but every time they tried to move the tree out of the way, the rain of thrown rocks and tree branches resumed, pinning the crew in the dubious cover of the 6x6 trucks. Things did not look good for our intrepid hero, so out of desperation, Pablo used his new roaring drum. That at least confused the attackers long enough for Pablo to pick up one of the broken tree branches. He then used it to smack the kapok tree, blocking the road to mimic the tree talk that he had learned from Bubbles. When an avalanche of thrown boulders didn't immediately mow him down, Pablo let loose with some loud hoop-hoops, reminiscent of the ones the Bigfoots made that he remembered from his youth. That brought a baker's dozen of rock apes out of the night-darkened jungle and into the shadowed light from the headlights of the 6x6 trucks. The rock apes were much shorter than the hairy people of California that he was familiar with. They were just as hairy, though, and almost as wide as they were tall, their short, squat bodies thick with bulging muscles. The rock apes shared many features with the Bigfoots that Pablo knew from his youth. They had similar flat noses and heavy brows, square teeth with fangs, short tusks on their lower jaws, and large hands with thick claw-like nails on the tips of their fingers. Pablo rolled a joint with trembling hands. He lit and hit the leño, exhaling a cloud of pot smoke as he approached the closest of the rock apes with his bag of soap slivers, and he offered the joint to it. Up close, Pablo noted that the rock apes were wearing simple loincloths similar to what the native Vietnamese of the Hmong tribe wore. Pablo also noted a strong odor similar to the one that he associated with Bubbles, and an earthy smell of unwashed bodies ammonia, and other jungle scents. The rock ape took the joint from Pablo and gave it the once-over smell test, and then it tried to hit the joint like it had seen Pablo do, but it only managed to inhale the whole lit joint, giving the rock ape a coughing fit that blew the still lit joint out of its flat nose, the cherry getting hung up on the man-beast's mustache, burning his upper lip. Pablo couldn't help but laugh as the rock ape slapped his own face to put out the fire on its lip. Then he pulled out a sliver of soap and mimed eating it before handing it to the rock ape with a grunt like the ones he remembered Bubbles making when she ate. The rock ape held up the sliver of soap to his nose, giving it a good sniff, followed by a tentative lick with a very human-looking pink tongue. The rock ape then chewed a corner of the soap, and finding it to his liking, made a noise that brought the other rock apes out of the dark and into the light. Pablo then gave some soap to all of the rock apes, who after a brief examination consumed the soap. Soon the rock apes were all happily blowing soap bubbles at the sky with their thick lips while lying on their backs. While the rock apes were thus preoccupied, the crew was able to winch the kapok tree out of the way and make their escape. Lieutenant Fuzzy and the rest of the crew were impressed with Pablo and no longer doubted his claim to have been with the Sasquatch. They told Pablo that he was going to get a medal for this action, but unfortunately, once they made it out of Monkey Mountain, the shortcut, and onto the main road, back to HQ, the 6x6 carrying Pablo and the lieutenant hit a landmine. Pablo woke up in a hospital back in Hawaii and learned that Lieutenant Fuzzy was killed when the truck ran over the landmine. After a few months of rehab, Pablo was discharged from the hospital. His enlistment was over too, but the army was still mad about the napalm barge and the whole trying to desert thing, so they sent him to a punishment regiment in Texas. He was there for more than 6 months. When the army was finally done with him, Pablo, flat broke, hitchhiked back home to California to try and pick up his life and put it back together. Not an easy feat when you're missing pieces, and the pieces you have left are bent out of shape. El Patron was happy to have Pablo back and gave him his old job back. Living in the woods was therapeutic for Pablo, but at the end of the growing season, he picked up a bad habit of drinking, a habit he still has, but his drinking and pot smoking has never kept him from doing the things that he had done to run his own life. He still drinks and smokes weed every day. He doesn't deal anymore though, as weed is now legal where he dwells. Pablo the gentleman farmer kissed a Bigfoot on the lips. So I definitely hope that I could do that story justice. It was wild to read it the first time. I don't even really have any specific other words other than to say that it's crazy, wild, strange, scary, and everything in between, and that I hope Pablo is doing well. So thank you to Mutant Buzzard for sending that in to me. I really enjoyed it, and I hope all of you did too. If you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, then please like and subscribe, and if you're already here, well, you already know the crazy stuff that I cover on the podcast and in my videos. So, if you would like to donate to the channel or contribute with a story, I have an email in the description below that you can send them to, as well as a PayPal and a Patreon if you would like to donate. And with all that, I hope you have a good Friday, a good weekend, and I'll see you Sunday. Thank you for pulling up a stump with me, and thank you for watching.